Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. You're watching WION The World, and this is World DNA. Let's begin with the headlines. U.S. Vice President JD Vance says talks with Iran failed to reach an agreement, says leaving after putting forward what he called the final and best offer. Iran's Revolutionary Guards threatened to deal severely with any military vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz after U.S. CENTCOM says 2 U.S. Navy warships had transited the strategic waterway to clear mines laid by Tehran. Qatar announces full resumption of all maritime navigation activities, permitting all categories of marine vessels and transport modes. Uncertainty remains over whether they will be allowed to transit through Hormuz. Police in London arrest more than 500 pro-Palestinian protesters at a demonstration in support of banned Group Palestine Action. Ukraine accuses Russia of repeatedly violating a truce to mark the Orthodox Easter, with nearly 470 incidents ranging from airstrikes and drone attacks to shelling. India sharply raises windfall taxes on diesel and aviation fuel exports to secure domestic supply amid high global prices. With disruptions near the Strait of Hormuz, the country also cut fuel duties and capped jet fuel price increases. We begin with breaking news. U.S. Vice President JD Vance has given an update on the talks that took place in Islamabad. Vance said that Washington and Tehran have not reached an agreement despite negotiating for over 21 hours in Islamabad. He said his delegation is going back without a deal, calling it a bad news for Iran more than the U.S. He said that they did not hear affirmative commitment that Iran will not seek nuclear weapon. Now let's hear into what JD Vance had said earlier.
First of all, to the Prime Minister of Pakistan and to Field Marshal Munir, who were both incredible hosts. And whatever shortcomings of the negotiation, it wasn't because of the Pakistanis, who did an amazing job and really tried to help us and the Iranians bridge the gap and get to a deal. We have been at it now for 21 hours, and we've had a number of substantive discussions with the Iranians. That's the good news. The bad news is that we have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the United States of America. So we go back to the United States having not come to an agreement. We've made very clear what our red lines are, what things we're willing to accommodate them on, and what things we're not willing to accommodate them on. And we've made that as clear as we possibly could, and they have chosen not to accept our terms. Questions?
Sir, Nick Robertson from CNN. Precisely what have they rejected here? Can you help us understand it a little bit?
Well, I won't go into all the details because I don't want to negotiate in public after we negotiated for 21 hours in private. But the simple fact is that we need to see an affirmative commitment that they will not seek a nuclear weapon, and they will not seek the tools that would enable them to quickly achieve a nuclear weapon. That is the core goal of the President of the United States, and that's what we've tried to achieve through these negotiations. Again, their nuclear program, such as it is, the enrichment facilities that they had before, they've been destroyed. But the simple question is, do we see a fundamental commitment of will for the Iranians not to develop a nuclear weapon, not just now, not just 2 years from now, but for the long term? We haven't seen that yet. We hope that we will. Jen.
Was there a framework on anything? And also, did the Iranian frozen assets come up, and did you reach any conclusions on those frozen assets?
We talked about all those issues, Jen, and we talked about a number of issues beyond that. And so certainly those things came up. But again, we just could not get to a situation where the Iranians were willing to accept our terms. I think that we were quite flexible. We were quite accommodating. The president told us, you need to come here in good faith and make your best effort to get a deal. We did that. And unfortunately, we weren't able to make any headway. Preston.
Mr. Vice President, how often did you communicate with President Trump throughout the negotiations? There were reports that there were multiple rounds where there were breaks in between negotiations. How often did you communicate with the president throughout those rounds, and what was he saying as you were going through these negotiations that you said fell short?
Yeah, obviously we were talking to the president consistently. I don't know how many times we talked to him, a half dozen times, a dozen times over the past 21 hours. We obviously also talked to Admiral Cooper, to Pete, to Marco, to the entire national security team. We talked to Scott Bessent a number of times. So look, we were constantly in communication with the team because we were negotiating in good faith. And we leave here with a very simple proposal, a method of understanding that is our final and best offer. We'll see if the Iranians accept it. Thank you.
And well, to discuss more now, we're being joined by Giorgio Cafiero from Washington, D.C., who is a professor at Georgetown University. Thank you so much for joining on the broadcast. And of course, I'll begin with a big statement from Vance here. 21 hours of negotiations, no deal done. Now, this is something that a lot of people were, of course, discussing, that it seemed like these are very strong points of contention that were between Iran and U.S., but at least there were 21 hours. Does it show that there was a willingness for an agreement? And big question, what happens next?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me back on your program. You know, there definitely was potential for these talks to kind of fall apart immediately. So the fact that they went on for this many hours really speaks to to get to your question, I think that really speaks to a desire on both the American and the Iranian side to participate in these talks, believing that there was something to gain from staying in Islamabad that many hours and engaging in this dialogue. I think this is the first time there has been so much direct talk between American and Iranian officials since over a decade ago. So it certainly was a historic moment. Obviously, though, the demands of the two sides are so far apart. The red lines, terms set forth by Washington and Tehran, very difficult to bridge. So I think only the most optimistic analysts were expecting a breakthrough today. It was a very difficult environment. But again, to get to your point, though, I think clearly there was an interest on both the parts of both the American and the Iranian delegations in having these talks and going through many, many different topics that were on the agenda.
And of course, now this ceasefire that was for 2 weeks, it still exists. And what we heard from Vance is they're going back without a deal. Interestingly, on the Iranian side, there were remarks saying that the third rounds or negotiations will still happen. So in that case, do you think there's a possibility, considering the fact there's a ceasefire that exists, do you think there is a possibility of going back to the negotiating table?
Well, certainly there's a possibility. At the same time, let's keep in mind that the ceasefire is very fragile and the situation is very delicate. So the ceasefire also could collapse at any moment, but it also could last throughout this whole duration of 2 weeks. It could possibly be extended.
Right. I'm really sorry to pause you right here. Now, these are the visuals we are actually getting from Islamabad with Vance actually leaving. And it looks like, well, they have left and they go back with, these are visuals that are coming in from Islamabad. Of course, we saw Vance now leaving for U.S. Yes, as I was saying, he's leaving, but we have some comments saying there might be talks coming in the next, of course, in the days of the ceasefire. Mr. Cafiero, please continue. I would.
Yeah, absolutely. Even with Vance departing from Pakistan, there definitely is going to be opportunities for the U.S. and Iran to have additional rounds of talks before this 2 week span is over. We'll have to see. But like I said, we also need to consider the possibility of the ceasefire itself completely collapsing. It's a very, very fragile truce. Maybe better to call it a pause rather than a truce.
Right. And of course, the other point of contention that was between them was Strait of Hormuz. But when we look at the points or JD Vance's remarks in the press conference, there wasn't any mention of that. The only thing that we're focused on was the nuclear enrichment or the nuclear power that the U.S. does not want Iran to have. Do you think that was a deliberate attempt of Vance not mentioning the Strait of Hormuz or any other issue apart from the nuclear power?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly what the vice president's reasoning was, but I do have to say that it would be rather difficult for me to imagine the Trump administration agreeing to some sort of an agreement with Tehran in which the Iranians maintain full control over the Strait of Hormuz. I think that would be a very, very painful concession for the United States to make. I think that issue will probably be one of the Trump administration's red lines. I have a difficult time imagining the White House proving to be too flexible on that front.
And as we talk, there are, of course, a Fars news agency which has said that both negotiating teams have stepped back to consult with their respective expert teams on proposed texts, with talks set to resume once these drafts are ready. These are remarks from Iran coming in, but of course, from the U.S. side, Vance has not really indicated any talks. They just said that they're going back without any deal. Why do you think there is a certain difference from the Iran side, and does it show any sort of who wants this deal more, U.S. or Iran?
You know, that's a great question. It's, I think, probably the case that the Trump side, that the Trump team is really trying to project some real toughness in this very rigid stance, rigid posture they have, trying to make it seem like it is Iran that stands to lose from the two sides failing to reach a deal. Certainly losing much more than the United States. The Trump administration's message is that the United States has the upper hand. Having said that, I think when we look at many of the realities on the ground in the region, including the Strait of Hormuz, it is going to be difficult, in my opinion, for the Trump administration to spin this as some sort of huge victory for the United States if there is not some sort of a deal. I think the decision on the part of Trump to agree to this Pakistani-mediated ceasefire earlier this month speaks to a realization that there are very, very serious limits as to what Washington can achieve through just sustained bombings of Iran, and that ultimately dealing with these delicate issues such as the Strait of Hormuz, the nuclear file, relationships with non-state actors in the region. It's ultimately going to require talking to the Iranians and diplomacy in one form or another in some location at some point. So if this ceasefire completely breaks down and there's no deal, I do think that is very bad news for the Trump administration. However, it's very possible that some in the administration don't see it that way and think that resuming the warfare is going to be the pathway toward a better outcome for the United States. That's not the way I look at it, but I think it's possible that the Trump administration sees it that way and is trying to send out the message that they don't really care if there's not a deal reached, and that it's Iran that is making a mistake by not being more flexible. I think on the Iranian side, though, the assessment is that time is on Tehran's side, not on Washington's. So we'll see, but I am not necessarily very optimistic about some sort of written agreement coming out of this 2 week ceasefire.
Professor Kefir, I would like to just pause for a moment. We have some breaking news coming in, and I would like your reaction. Now, we've been talking about the Iranian media, and we have breaking news coming in. Iranian media has said that Iran-U.S. negotiations have ended, with the two sides not reaching an agreement. It said various issues, including Strait of Hormuz, nuclear rights, have been among the points of contention in Iran-U.S. talks, adding that U.S. excessive demands have hindered a common framework and agreement. Now, of course, these are the remarks coming in from the Iranian media. Of course, another Iranian media, Fars news agency, has said that the path to the deal hinges on U.S. changing its unreasonable demands and that the Strait of Hormuz is one of several contentious issues to be resolved. Now, the agency said experts on both sides are working to find common ground and that the Pakistani mediator is trying to resolve differences and bring opinions. Both negotiating teams have stepped back to consult with their respective expert teams on proposed text, with talks set to resume once those drafts are ready. Now, Iran, of course, another Iran media has said Iran-U.S. negotiations have ended with the two sides not reaching an agreement. Now, this, of course, reaction that we were discussing, Professor Kefiero, about this Iranian media saying that there's no agreement, but it seems like there would be some consultations or proposed talks that will be happening in the coming weeks between these ceasefire to happen. And it's very interesting because you also mentioned that, we have the Strait of Hormuz. There were media reports of these two warships, USS Frank E. Peterson, USS Michael Murphy, in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, what CENTCOM had posted saying that the U.S. forces had begun setting conditions for clearing mines in the Strait of Hormuz and that the two vessels transited the Strait of Hormuz. Now, this was clearly denied by Iran. Professor Kefiero, do you think that there might be a chance of escalation considering the fact that you have these U.S. assets already ready in West Asian region?
Well, yes, obviously the situation in the Gulf and elsewhere in the region, it's extremely intense right now. So it would not take much for the very fragile ceasefire to completely collapse at any moment, as I've mentioned before. But I do want to also make another point here that between now and when this 2-week period is over, I'm expecting not only Pakistan, but other states in West Asia, such as Turkey, Egypt, and Oman, which all want to see some sort of a diplomatic breakthrough very badly. All of these countries share a vested interest in de-escalation. They do not want to see the warfare between U.S. and Israel on one side and Iran on the other resume. So I certainly am expecting in upcoming days, Pakistan, as well as those other countries I mentioned, to try to do everything they can in their capacities as bridging states. Whether those efforts will be successful or not, we don't know. It will be very difficult for them to try to mediate between Washington and Tehran and to help the two countries find some middle area where they can compromise and reach a deal. But I think we're going to see an intensification of those efforts in these upcoming days.
And also, because we're talking about the other countries, we had reports saying that Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dud had flown to Beijing to seek Chinese backing for a 5-point peace plan to end this conflict. As you know, of course, Trump's remarks had come on that as well, saying that China would face big problems if it ships arms to Iran. Considering the fact that China's role here with the Pakistani Foreign Minister in Beijing right now, what kind of role do you think China will be playing, or would they be playing any role diplomatically or militarily?
Well, obviously, China is an extremely important country to Iran, and there's certain influence that China has over Iran that no other country in the world has. And therefore, I think we can see Beijing perhaps using its leverage, using its geoeconomic clout to try to push Tehran toward a position of being a little more flexible in these talks, because China certainly wants to see de-escalation in the Middle East. All of this chaos and warfare, very, very bad for China's ambitions in the Middle East, which really depend on stability, peace, and more trade, more investment. So I think there is a very productive role that China could play. Again, to answer your question, I think it's going to be more on the diplomatic side. I don't think China will want to get caught up too much in the military side of this. China tends to avoid intervening in conflicts, and I think China would be very careful before taking any steps that would result in perceptions based in reality or not of China being sort of an all-out Iran ally that's very much backing up Tehran. I think China is going to be very careful about taking steps that could lead to that perception.
Right, and also I would like me to give any kind of perspective on JD Vance, because of course he happened to be, of course, the vice president going for talks here, the senior-most delegation, and then of course we had remarks from Trump saying that if a deal is done, it's my win, and if we fail, then it's Vance, because of the fact that Vance has been saying that they were being flexible and accommodating, but they did not land a deal. What does this mean for JD Vance?
It's a very good question. It's useful to see this also from the standpoint of domestic politics in the United States. Many people see JD Vance as sort of the heir to the MAGA throne, which makes sense given his position as Trump's vice president and also given his politics as well. And this war is not necessarily very popular among elements within the MAGA base who see it as a betrayal of the America First agenda and who see the administration sort of putting Israel first. Among right-wing segments in the United States, that's certainly an interpretation shared by many. So I think the idea of JD Vance playing a role in diplomacy here is something that sits well with many in Trump's base and just sort of right-wing circles in the United States who are not in favor of Operation Epic Fury. I also think at the same time there is baggage between Kushner and Witkoff on one side and the Iranians on the other. We obviously can recall the talks that were taking place earlier this year, and then also those talks that were taking place in the lead up to last year's 12-day war. I think when we have Vance involved, it maybe possibly has a little bit of potential to set a new tone and to change the dynamics and maybe give the Iranians a little bit more reason to be optimistic about what can come out of this, what can come out of such dialogue. And we do know that the Iranians have indicated that their preference is for dealing with Vance as opposed to Witkoff or Kushner.
Right. And just adding to that, when Vance says, when we look at these remarks coming from Vance, where he says that we're going back with no deal, there is no mention of talks, but when the Iran media says that there will be talks going forward, how do you assess this dynamic from the U.S. side and the Iranian side saying that there will be talks going forward?
Well, it's not that surprising. The fact that JD Vance is not talking about a new round certainly doesn't mean that there's not going to be a new round. Going back to a point I was making a few minutes ago, I think the tone from Vance and the U.S. side here is one of being very confident, trying to send out the message that it is going to be Iran's loss, not the United States' loss, if an agreement is not reached. And therefore, the administration is not determined to get an agreement at all costs. An agreement only can come if Iran is willing to respect the Trump administration's red lines. So I think, obviously in these types of situations, the signaling, the messaging is always really important. And that is really how I'm reading sort of the tone set forth by Vance as he is declaring that this 21 hours or whatever in Islamabad failed to bring the two sides to an agreement.
Right. And the fact that there were some experts saying that, yes, it's very difficult because there are so many points of contention, since there are some reports of talks to happen in the coming days. Do you see these talks, 21-hour talks, as a failure or a win concerning the situation it happened in?
Well, I would have to ask, do you mean a failure or a win for the United States or for one of the other countries? From which perspective?
Absolutely. I would like to perspective on which one won here. Is it Iran or U.S. for them individually? Do these talks seem to be like a win for after 21 hours or a loss?
Well, I think what ultimately matters is what these talks produce. I definitely do think that a continuation of this war is going to be very disastrous from the standpoint of U.S. interests. I also think that is true for Iranian interests. We see the widespread humanitarian disasters, the horrific human suffering in Iran. All of that would obviously exacerbate to entirely new levels if the very intense American and Israeli military operations and bombing campaigns resume. So I think both sides are going to lose if there is an inability to find a way to compromise and reach an agreement. But both sides will, of course, try to spin this and make it seem as though they have the upper hand. And I think it should be noted that the fact that Iran's government is still in power after not only the 12-day war in June of last year, but also since February 28th, it's certainly a sign of resilience. And I think probably after the mass protests that took place in December of last year and January of this year, I think the war has certainly given the regime an opportunity to sort of tighten up unity and support within Iran. So in some ways, we have to recognize that the war has served interests of the Iranian government. Obviously, many of the very high-ranking officials, including the previous supreme leader, were killed in this war, but nonetheless, the regime has proven to be very resilient, and its strategies for surviving a war waged on Iran by the world's most powerful military force, as well as the Middle East's most powerful military force, both being nuclear armed states, speaks to that resilience. But again, that is not to be dismissive of the fact that the Iranian people have suffered so much, not only since February 28th, but especially since Operation Epic Fury began. The massive destruction of civilian infrastructure in the country has made life very, very difficult. But again, I'll repeat the point. This war has been an opportunity for the Islamic Republic to really demonstrate its strength and resilience. Right. And that is going to certainly have an impact on Iran's image in the Middle East, probably for many years to come.
All right, well, 21 hours of talks and no agreement, but, well, the ceasefire does exist. I will have to wait and see if the talks happen and going forward. Thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast and giving your perspective. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
We're going to be calling a wrap to World Day for today. News and updates will follow on the other side with all the updates from West Asia. Thanks for staying with us. Stay tuned.
will.i.am unveils a futuristic trike. Cleopatra's World brought back to life. Apple just turned 50 in the blink of an eye. Stop doom scrolling, lest life pass you by. All these stories and more coming up on this episode of Tech It Out at these times.
On Wings this week, we cover how Indians are increasingly opting for domestic travel as flight disruptions and fare hike affect international travel. We meet William Heineke to better understand luxury tourism and how Anantara is now eyeing a major entry into the Indian market. Also on the show, festivals from Kashmir to China. Only on WION. World is One.
From the bustling trading floors of Wall Street to the vibrant exchanges of Asian stock markets, WION breaks it down for you to make sense of what's happening, as we reveal the key factors behind events, strategic battles, and the game-changing business decisions that shape the world. We bring you all of this and more on World Business Watch. Get the latest updates. Breaking news. Credible, clear, continuous. Experts across aisles. Diverse voices, one platform. WION World is One. 5 states, one powerful voice. From Tamil Nadu to West Bengal. Kerala to Assam. Every vote shapes the future. Get the election pulse only on WION.
Welcome back. You're watching WION World is One. I'm Shivan Janna. There's no agreement between the Iranians and the Americans. We're tracking all the developments